Hey folks, and welcome to this week's Weaver's Woodshop. This week I will be making a cutting board, and I did not get video of me cutting the wood to length, but you've all seen me do that before. So here I am over at the table saw, getting the fence set up to cut all of the boards to the proper width. But I'll go ahead and tell you about the wood that I'm going to be using. It's all considered exotic and it is hardwood. The wood that I'm going to be using, what's on the table saw right now, is Cuban Mahogany. I will also be using some zebra stripe wood. I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this next one correctly or not, but I'm going to say it's pronounced Padauk wood, Wenge wood, and maple wood. The zebra stripe will obviously be the one that's got the stripes in it. That one that's going through the table saw right now is the Padauk wood, and then the dark wood, that one right there, is the Wenge wood, and then the maple wood, which will come in later because it's cut to size from a previous project. That will be a very light colored wood. And now comes one of the most critical steps in the process of making a cutting board. I have all these different strips of different colored woods. I got to figure out how they're all going to go together. So that's what I'm doing here. I've got them all set out, and you try and figure out how they are all going to go together and how they're going to look best the way they go together. And you'll see the maple wood. Like I said, it's already cut to size from a previous project, and I've got it all set together, and I'm just kind of arranging it there. And you'll see me probably scratch my head and maybe even stroke my beard a little bit and move pieces around and flip it over and around and about, and eventually I come up with a plan that I like, and I think the finished product ends up coming out pretty good. So stick around and see what I come up with. Alright, now that I've decided on where everything is going on the so-called pattern, it's time to glue it up. So I got everything turned on the side and going to grab the glue, and now it's time, like I said, to start gluing it up. So I am going to go ahead and start spreading the glue out and getting everything ready to squeeze it together. And remember, when you glue something up, even though you always use clamps and things like that, you don't squeeze those clamps real tight together. You just kind of snug them up to where the glue starts to come out and you start to get a little bit of squeeze out. You don't get them super tight. Just get them a little bit snug and you're good. That's all you need, just snug. You don't need them super tight. And I tell you, these 60-inch Harbor Freight clamps work great for glue ups. They really do. So, I've got all the pieces turned over. I got the glue good and spread out on them. I've just snugged up the 60-inch clamps. And now what I've got is I've got some scrap wood on the edges of, my good wood of the cutting board, because I want to get those as flush as I can on both sides. So that's what I'm doing here. And I'm just getting everything snug. I'm not getting it super tight. I'm putting those two clamps on. Got the one clamp on. And now I'm getting ready to put the other clamp on. But as you'll see right here, this clamp isn't quite long enough. Oops. Okay, so I'll go grab another clamp. And then once I put this clamp on, then I'll go ahead and snug up the 60-inch clamps, and I let it dry overnight. Since I know I'm going to run this cutting board through the planer, I don't worry about cleaning up any squeeze out. So I let it dry overnight, and I come back the next morning. If you like this kind of material and maybe you're getting something out of this, if you'd like to go ahead and hit that like and subscribe and share this video on out, I sure would appreciate it. So here's where we're leaving off that night. Here it is, all glued up and clamped together. And now here I am coming out the next morning ready to take the clamps off. So I'm taking the clamps off, and you notice that those two end pieces, I just got lucky that no glue really got on them. But typically, they get stuck and you gotta, twist them off, and it's really no big deal. But it does get stuck a little bit to those clamps. You just got to make sure that the clamps are loose, and just kind of twist it on up and they pop right off. And that's all I had to do. There goes one, and then you get the other, and it's no big deal really. So now that we've taken it out of the clamps and the glue is all good and dry, gonna run it through the planer a handful of times, and that just assures that everything is nice and level and smooth, and definitely takes care of any of the dried up squeeze out that you might have. And this gets you ready to go over and start sanding and getting ready for oiling. And now I wanted to soften the edges, the top edge a little bit. But before I did that, I needed to kind of secure the cutting board down a little bit. And so I used that scrap piece of wood because I didn't want to take the chance of putting an indentation or marking up the cutting board. So I used that scrap piece of wood and those two little speed clamps there, or squeeze clamps, whatever you want to call them. And again, I just snugged it down, didn't have to get it real tight. And I'm going to use the router, and I believe it was just a little 1/4 wrench round over bit, and I just went around that top edge, and again, it just gave it a little, just a nice little round over, and it softened up that edge real nice. All right, now it's time to sand. Here I am. I'm starting with an 80 grit. That's just what I always start with, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if coming out of the planer, if it's pretty similar to an 80 grit already. But I think the 80 grit just helps kind of get rid of any imperfections that a saw blade or the planer or anything else might have left on it. So that's what I always start with, is an 80 grit. I am going to end up putting an Odie's oil on this. So I go from an 80 grit to a 120 grit, then to a 220, then to a 320. I believe with Odie's oil, you can go all the way up to like 1,500 or 2,000 or something like that. Me personally, for this, I stopped at 320. And that worked out great for this cutting board. So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm just going through the grits all the way up to 320. Now I'm done sanding, and before I actually put the Odie's oil on, I'm just wiping it off and trying to get any dust or anything off of it. And I'm also wiping it kind of loosely. I don't have a death grip on that paper towel, seeing if I can find any burrs or anything that still needs to be sanded before I go and put any of this Odie's oil on. So that's another thing I'm doing with that paper towel. So there it is before the Odie's oil, and now here I go applying the Odie's oil. And if you've never used Odie's oil, I actually do have a video on my first time ever using Odie's oil. Man, I tell you, I'm a fan of Odie's oil. If you've never used it before, I believe that little jar you see sitting there costs like 35, 40 bucks off of Amazon. And I've used it now a handful of times, and it seems like it's going to last forever. But Odie's oil is a food safe oil. It smells good. It doesn't irritate your skin. It goes a long way, and you just use a Scotch-Brite pad. So it's a really good oil that you can use on just about anything. I guess about the only downfall on something like a cutting board or a tabletop is you do have to reapply it, you know, when you see it wearing off. So that would be maybe a negative. So that would be something to consider. And with Odie's oil, they say to let it dry at least 40 minutes. But they, you know, the longer it dries, the harder it is to buff off. And they say if you come back in 40 minutes and you can see your fingerprints, then it's good to go ahead and buff off. If you cannot see your fingerprints, that you need to reapply some more Odie's oil. I have not had the opportunity or the need to reapply another coat of Odie's oil yet. So I haven't had that experience yet. What I'm using here is just an old sock, and it worked out great. I guess the negative would be the little fuzzies of the sock. You'll see I do have to pick them off every now and then, but it worked out great. I just put my hand inside the sock, and the white sock works out great, because as soon as you see it starting to get full of that oil, that Odie's oil, you reposition the sock on your hand to a clean part of the sock, and you start wiping and buffing it off. But as you can see, with my hand in the sock, I can grab the board and move the board and get around the edges and stuff, and it worked out really good. Odie's oil, they say it takes about 3 days for it to fully cure before you can actually use it. But man, that just came out really nice. The way those thin strips of maple are bordering the pieces of Wenge and the Padauk, and I mean it just really, really came out nice. So like I said, I'm a fan of the Odie's oil. I'm a fan of that cutting board. And I'm a fan of my mother-in-law, which is who this cutting board is for. So it all works out in the end. And now that we're done with wiping it off, here are some pictures of the finished product. Again, I think it came out really good. Thank you for watching this week's Weaver's Woodshop, and we'll see you next week.